Today's message is titled Religion and Justice, Repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery. So I've shared several times that when I went to seminary, I was going into the social transformation program. I was working in nonprofits, and I was thinking about going into kind of faith-based nonprofit organizing, probably around climate change. That was my vision, and I got this opportunity to do this internship at the UCC church on Madeline Island. It is a very unique church. It's an ecumenical church, and I was like, I don't know why I'd do that. It's not like I'm going to be a minister. But I ended up accepting the position, and they sent me to the Wisconsin statewide annual conference in 2018. And there I was, kind of, skeptical of organized religion, and I accidentally sat in the section with all the retired ministers. And so I was like, okay, here I am, and it's opening worship, and I'm like, what is this even going to be about? And don't get me wrong, I was raised up in the Christian tradition, but man, I was just really struggling with some things when it comes to religion. And that night at worship, the worship director is leading these songs, and he's singing, Doctrine of Discovery, we renounce as heresy. Now God is healing history with justice and love. And now, as skeptical as I was like, what is this? What are we doing? Oh my goodness, I'm kind of getting into this, right? And all these retired ministers are up there, and they're starting to sway, and they're just belting it out, and I'm like, okay, I'm feeling it. Doctrine of Discovery, we renounce as heresy. And pretty soon I'm feeling spiritual. I'm like, woo, all right, I rarely feel this way in American Protestant churches. We were this huge auditorium, hundreds of people in direct relationship with what is often called America's original sin, racism. And we were taking this step towards liberation, towards reconciliation. We were singing it out, and I had my fist pumps going, now God is healing history with justice and love. Woo, I was fired up. Similar to the Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ has congregational polity, which means that churches, individuals bring resolutions for change, for the governance, for the collective action and witnessing of the church, and you vote on them at these annual meetings, and that then becomes part of the direction and the mission of the work of the collective. And that's what we were voting on, was this resolution to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. It had been brought forward by the UCC Ho-Chunk Fellowship in Wisconsin, and as I reviewed the resolution, getting ready to cast my vote, I realized I was confused. We were actually voting not on the repudiation, but a year-long study of the doctrine of discovery to decide if we were going to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. I was stunned. I was like, how did I get this wrong? I'm here to vote, to study it? I mean, how much more do we need to know? This was the most liberal, social justice-oriented Christian denomination in the world, and we're gonna think about it? We're gonna have a Facebook group about it? I mean, how much more would it take before we were like shouting and pounding our fists and fist pumping to the song that the time had come to say, not one more day? And then I took a breath, because I've been part of community organizing and justice movements for a long time. And I know that to change hearts and minds, it's not enough to just make a decision behind the closed doors in an auditorium, but you actually have to have the efforts march into the public square. And it does start with education, and it does start with awareness, and it needs to move out of that sphere. So I voted yes. I voted yes to that study of the doctrine of discovery. And what I learned over the next year of being in conversation with groups like this about this topic was that, of course, this is a lifelong learning topic. And today's message is only going to be able to give just a little bit of that. Whether you are new to the study of the doctrine of discovery or have thoroughly examined it, I hope that today's message provides an opportunity to wonder. To wonder, what does repudiation, to deny the truth of the doctrine of discovery, actually mean for humanity today? Now, many of us have learned about the doctrine of discovery from voices, from history books that were written by those other than those who were victimized by it. Indigenous elder George Emiris from the Dene Nation said, "When common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." My social location includes being a white, middle-class, middle-aged, Midwestern American. I am both limited by and fueled by my unique perspectives and experiences. I have learned from people, been in conversation with people from very different social locations than my own, and I do not speak for them, but I want to share some of the learning of what I understand to be this shared memory, a memory that I didn't have when I first was taught about the doctrine of discovery. So you may know that in the 1400s, as European monarchies were going on expeditions across the globe, and they were reaching places that no European nation had gone before, they asked the Pope for guidance. Do we have the rights to these lands? Do we have a duty to share Christianity with these people? And Pope Nicholas V wrote a papal bull, which is a creedal statement on behalf of the Catholic Church, which read, "Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit." Another papal bull was added in 1493. 1493. Does that date resonate at all? Okay, so the year after Columbus got lost at sea and returned to Spain, this bull clarified that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and ruled. From the UCC, the United Church of Christ resolution that we were studying before we would adopt, the Ho-Chunk people summarized it in this way. "We were told that God had declared that the Pope rules all people, regardless of their law, sect, or belief, and this includes Christians, Moors, Jews, Gentiles, or any other sect of people. The Native Americans were to come forward of their own free will to convert to Catholicism, or with the help of God, we shall use force against you, declaring war upon you from all sides and with all possible means, and we shall bind you to the yoke of the church and their highnesses. We shall enslave your persons, wives and sons, sell you or dispose of you as the king sees fit. We shall seize your possessions and harm you as much as we can as disobedient and resisting vassals, and furthermore, natives who resist are to be held guilty of all resulting deaths and injuries from the just war waged against them." These and the other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493 collectively became known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And while it originated within the Catholic Church, it became a guide for Protestants and Catholics alike. That term discovery is so telling. It implies that the people discovered were not equal to those who were doing the discovering. Some will use the term Europeans as synonymous with the doctrine of discovery, but many encourage to really use the word Christendom, that the Christian empire says that God is giving permission for one human being to treat another human being as less than, as property, as one that does not have rights, say, to the lands that they have lived on, to where their ancestors are buried. Now, there are specific texts in the Old Testament that provided this justification. They are called the conquest narratives. In the book of Joshua, we have the Israelites having fled slavery from the book of Exodus, and they have wandered through the desert looking for their home. They have this promised land that God has given to their ancestors, and they are moving towards it. They cross the Jordan River, and Moses' successor, Joshua, acquires the land of Canaan. And that acquisition is said to be a land that is the gift of God, and God battles for them. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 3, it reads, "Every place that your foot will tread upon, I have given to you." And in chapter 24, verse 13, it reads, "I give you a land on which you had not labored, and towns that you had not built, and you live in them. You eat the fruits of vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant." Now, one of the most well-known conquest narratives is the fall of Jericho, the story about the Israelites moving into their promised lands, and they march upon the city of Jericho, and just by marching around the cities and the city walls that encircled the city, while the priests were blowing their horns, on the seventh day the walls came tumbling down, and this was their land. Christendom Europeans identified as the chosen people in this story, recreating this again and again as they conquered lands across the world, killing, converting, enslaving the people who they encountered. And the people who came to this country, what is now known as America, they knew this story. They knew that this was their story. How else do we explain that there is a Canaan, Vermont, a Canaan, Maine, a Canaan, New York, a New Canaan, Connecticut, a Canaan, West Virginia, and countless streets and public squares with that same name? But there are some very important differences between the book of Joshua in the 13th century BCE and the expansion of Christendom in the 15th century CE. First and foremost, the story in the book of Joshua is not historical. Given the significance of this story, archaeologists have been looking to prove, they want the archaeological evidence that will show where these walls came tumbling down. How big was Jericho? How much did they conquer? And despite repeated archaeological digs, what they have been able to find is that if the city of Jericho was there at all, it would have been a poor, small, unwalled village. Most likely, it was an uninhabited ruin. The story that has given permission and rationalization from God for dehumanization is just a story. Now, how do we explain this? Well, we understand from the tradition that this story was written in is that this is a theological story. This is people in conversation, in dialogue with an oral tradition, trying to understand who they are and what they need for survival. And one of the unique things about the text is it sounds like this is a mighty, mighty force, but this is a nomadic tribe that has been moving across the desert. They are a minority population. They are fairly helpless. Now, Native American commentaries on the story of Jericho have said that you can read it in two ways. One is if you view it from the view of empire, it absolutely says, yes, its mighty force goes out, conquers, and steals another's land. And it makes what happened here in America very synonymous with that reading of the story. However, if you read it from the point of view of a minority population, Native American scholars share that this is warrior language. It sounds like what they would have said to one another when they were trying to mount an expedition, mount a task, something where they were less resourced, And they needed inspiration and encouragement to do something that could not be done. When I thought of that language in that way, it reminded me of a rally that I was at, and the language that the rally leader said was, "We will march, and we will shout, and we will stay here, and we will not quit until childhood hunger has been obliterated for all." Now, did that really happen? No. But they were trying to inspire a movement, or perhaps another famous organizer who said, "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain." Is that literally what happened? Thinking of it in these terms, we can see that the language we use for an insurmountable task based on a belief is something that says one thing, but perhaps is a metaphor. And when a dominant culture co-opts a minority's sacred story, what my professor said to me is, and they believe it's only for them, it is like a world power adopting superpowers, and it is abusive every single time. And it is like a divine blessing for unlimited abuse against others. So, with the doctrine of discovery, many believed that the promised land was this country. And as long as they were faithful to God, this country would be their land. What would you do for a promise like that? What personal, ethical, moral boundaries would you cross? Now, I have a lot of love for Christianity, but I cannot reconcile Christendom with the story of Christ. And I cannot reconcile the story of Christ with the doctrine of discovery. All across the world, this was happening. We know India, Africa, Australia, the Americas. But in the colonies, one of the unique things that happened was that in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains and declared that the colonies did not have the right to discover the land to the west of that line. And the colonies were like, "Well, but you told us we had that right. We want to discover that land. We want to keep going. We're growing. We're expanding." And so they wrote a letter of protest, and it was signed on July 4th, 1776. Yeah, the Declaration of Independence, saying that they have the right to discover lands west of that line. And of course, soon after that came the U.S. Constitution. And again, that being all about land ownership for whom? Not for women, not for Native Americans, and African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person in that document. And that is how the doctrine of discovery became embedded in land and land ownership in this country. So about 40 years after the Revolutionary War was fought, a land dispute occurred. Two men of European descent both claimed they owned the same piece of land. They wanted to know who owned it. One had bought it from the Native American tribe, and one had bought it from, or had gotten it from the government. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It's called Johnson versus McIntosh, and they ruled that discovery gave land titles their rights. So this established the legal precedent that still stands today in the laws of this land. So the case references that the doctrine of discovery states that indigenous people were here first, but they're less than human. So they only have what's called the right of occupancy, like a deer would occupy the forest. Europeans, however, have the right to discovery to the land, the fee title to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. So this is no longer a Catholic papal bull. It is now the law of the Supreme Court. One of the associate justices on the Supreme Court at that time was Joseph Story, who was also the president of the American Unitarian Association. So this is history, right? Except that it's still deciding cases today. One of the more famous ones was in 2005, the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. This went all the way to the Supreme Court. Essentially, the Oneida tribe bought their ancestral lands on market value. They paid for the lands, and they wanted to revert those back to their tribal lands, which means that they come off the tax rolls, right? Because tribal lands, you don't pay tax because you are a sovereign nation. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city of Sherrill, saying that the Oneida tribe did not have the right to restore tribal sovereignty to that land because of the Doctrine of Discovery. And who wrote that case? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, Ginsburg is often known as siding with an anti-oppression point of view in many of the cases, but we also know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg loved the law. She was a student of the law, and she said this is the correct interpretation of the law on the books. It may have been justice, but is it equality? It may be the law, but is it equitable? And this is one of the reasons I love land acknowledgement, is because it reminds us each and every time we gather that this is still something that we hold, and we acknowledge that. And I hope that by the next generation, we no longer need a land acknowledgement. And this is why when my relatives said, Black lives matter, no, all lives matter. And I said, you're missing the point. There's a disproportionate historical basis for the amount of oppression and the lack of seeing someone else as fully human that we have to move against in vocal, in active ways. When we hear campaign slogans like "Make America Great Again," we know that they're hearkening back to this kind of theology. And if you know about some of the things that happened under the last administration that said "Make America Great Again," one of the things that was repealed and rolled back was the Religious Freedom Act was placed and interpreted in a way in hospitals that said that doctors could refuse care to someone who was transgender or LGBTQ plus because it violated their religious beliefs. So previously, if you went into an ER, a doctor had to care for you, no matter who you were, no matter what your identity was. And that repeal, a doctor can do that and have no negative consequences based on the new interpretation of the Religious Freedom Act. This is so interwoven in so many different ways. My goodness, I have like a small lecture. And I need to wrap it up because I really want to make sure that we have time for community conversation. Davey, can I ask you to cue the slides real quick? I just want to share that there are things that are happening within Indigenous land movements, and I'm happy to share more about those, but perhaps at a later date. But for now, I just want to focus on how so many different Christian denominations are finding a real crisis of faith. That once we know about these things, we can't just go along with them. And as uncomfortable as it is to unlayer the wounds of history, it's more uncomfortable to go forward and continue to build a country, a future, a family on unjust laws. So the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship and an association for 45 years has been having this conversation, rolling out education. They've voted several times on the repudiation, called for collective witness and action. And so I hope that today is, just another piece of that long line of Unitarian Universalist acknowledgement of this. In 2012, and this really came on the heels of the UN's work with Indigenous sovereignty and rights, that the World Council of Churches created a statement which specifically repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery. Next slide, please. The Episcopal Church was actually the first Christian denomination to come forward with a statement of repudiation, and that was in 2009. The United Church of Christ first had their statement in 2013. I mentioned they had in Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, they had a kind of a refocus of that in 2018 and then again in 2019. Bucky Beach, who preaches here once a month, shared that a few years ago he taught a class in the Lutheran church that he was a part of on the Doctrine of Discovery, and it led to the ELCA, the Lutheran Church Synod, to renouncing it, and about 17 other ELCA synods, those are state groups usually, or kind of regional groups, have done the same. Next slide, please. The United Methodist Church, the Mennonite Church, the Quakers have all come out with statements repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, the Mennonite and Quakers, they don't have like a hierarchical structure, so it's been done in individual communities. You can close the slideshow. If you'd like that text, let me know. I can share it with you in an email, or you can get it from the slideshow. Accepting wrongs, accepting responsibility for wrongs is essentially a religious idea. And without religion in motion, in a modern culture, and the goodwill that comes behind that motion, social change on this topic, on the Doctrine of Discovery, is likely to only come through legal measures. It is no wonder that when I visited the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, and I was there for a leadership summit, I asked their people and their leaders, what is your hope for the future? And they said, our hope is that our young people become lawyers and come back and work for our tribes. Religion in motion has the potential to plant a new seed of compassion and true kinship in this country. To take action, I believe, is to see ourselves in a different relationship with the land. What Indigenous people often call the land was what I was taught to call nature. And nature is a republic unto itself, has its own sovereignty. Land ownership is slightly absurd. So let us march. Let us blow our horns and let the walls come tumbling down. The walls that block what has been from what can be. The walls that enclose us in fear, in a spirit of poverty, trying to protect what is mine, instead of the spirit of generosity and community, about building a country where we truly are, we the people.